Let's now get to the news in detail. The Pakistani military says a 2-year-old minor has been martyred, while 4 civilians have been injured in the Indian Army's unprovoked cross-border firing. Earlier, 8 civilians were injured due to the Indian aggression along the working boundary and the line of control. The military's media wing said Indian troops targeted civilians in Baro, Dunyal, Rakchikri and Shirikot sectors along the line of control. The Inter-Services Public Relations said the Pakistani Army effectively responded and targeted Indian posts, which initiated the fire. Meanwhile, Pakistan has summoned the Indian Charge d'Affaires to register a protest, over these ceasefire violations. Condemning the aggression, Islamabad called these acts a clear violation of the 2003 ceasefire understanding. People in occupied Kashmir have protested against the Indian Army for using them as human shields for their aggression against Pakistan. Despite the coronavirus pandemic, Indian forces continue unprovoked firing along the border, injuring civilians. Locals in Kupwara district have demonstrated against occupation forces for positioning artillery virtually next to their homes. Residents said the army has started firing on Pakistani posts across the line of control, endangering their lives. Meanwhile, occupied Kashmir is still reeling under an Indian-imposed curfew and communications blackout for the past 253 days. The Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan has asked overseas citizens to donate to the government's coronavirus relief fund. In a televised message, Khan said through these donations and the Tiger Force, Pakistan will defeat this pandemic. Khan said developed states have allocated trillions of dollars, while Pakistan could only manage $8 billion. He said a website has been launched where overseas citizens can donate to the relief fund. Meanwhile, the coronavirus death toll in Pakistan has surged to 93 after 7 people died over the past 24 hours. The health ministry said with 366 new cases, total infections have climbed to almost 5,400, while nearly 1,100 patients have recovered. The World Health Organization has handed over protective kits to the National Disaster Management Authority. The new coronavirus continues to wreak havoc in the U.S., with over 1,500 more people dying overnight as the death toll tops 22,000. The worldwide death toll from the new coronavirus has now crossed 114,000, with over 1.8 million infections. More on that now in this report.
Experts are blaming governments for not acting timely on the coronavirus pandemic, which has cost thousands of lives. U.S. top health official Dr. Anthony Fauci is now facing President Donald Trump's wrath after saying an early lockdown could have saved many lives. He also suggested that parts of the U.S. can begin returning to normal as early as May. But governor of the U.S.'s worst-hit state, New York, warns against any hasty steps.
We want to reopen as soon as possible. The caveat is we need to be smart in the way we reopen. What does smart mean? It means a coordinated approach, a regional approach, and a safe approach. Nobody wants to pick between a public health strategy and an economic strategy. As governor of the state, I'm not going to pick one over the other.
Meanwhile, the death rate in Italy and France, 2 of the worst affected countries, finally appears to be slowing down. Both countries have reported the lowest daily death toll since weeks of raging pandemic. In their research, neurologists say the virus has mutated in different patterns, as its various strains have been found around the world so far.
We are sequencing the virus from every infected person. Is that in spite of the fact that the virus has relatively low mutation rate, it has infected so many individuals in the world that it has had a lot of opportunity to mutate. So if you look worldwide, there is a very large number of mutations in this virus.
China has raised alarm over a surge in imported cases that can spark a second wave of COVID-19.
In India, resident doctors are suffering in their fight against COVID-19 due to inadequate management by the government. Doctors say authorities have crammed medics in small hostels, making social distancing impossible. Doctors said they are sharing one room with 3 to 4 medics, with their mattresses at 1 to 2 feet apart. Meanwhile, truck drivers with essential goods are still stuck at state borders due to the shutdown in the country. Drivers have been forced to sleep and live inside their vehicles or temporary shelters with little food supply. The Indian Health Ministry has reported 333 deaths and nearly 9,300 coronavirus infections across that country. The Afghan government says it has released over 360 more Taliban prisoners from Bagram prison. The Kabul administration earlier released 300 inmates in 3 batches under the Doha peace deal. The National Security Council spokesperson Javed Faisal said Kabul would release another 1,500 prisoners under President Ashraf Ghani's order. The U.S. has welcomed the recent prisoner swap between the Taliban and Afghan government. U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad said the inmates' release is an important step in the peace process and reduction in violence. He said the two sides should accelerate efforts to meet targets specified in the U.S.-Taliban Doha Agreement as soon as possible. The envoy said potential for COVID-19 outbreaks in prisons poses a real threat. Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif says unity among different groups in Afghanistan is essential for peace. Zarif made that statement while holding a telephone conversation with his Afghan counterpart, Hanif Atmar. The Iranian foreign minister emphasized on the importance of political structures based on the constitution for stability in Afghanistan. The Afghan foreign minister said the two sides agreed to work to build consensus for the ceasefire and peace efforts. Atmar thanked his Iranian counterpart for supporting the Afghan government's humanitarian ceasefire call. Yemen's Saudi-led coalition says Houthi rebels have violated the ceasefire agreement more than 240 times in 48 hours. The coalition said rebels used all kinds of light and heavy weaponry and ballistic missiles while violating the truce. The coalition had declared a ceasefire last week over the COVID-19 pandemic. The coalition said it is adhering to the truce and called on the international community to exert pressure on Houthis to do the same. Houthis claim that they retaliated to the coalition's attacks on Ma'rib and Al-Bayda provinces. Yemen has been entangled in violence and chaos since 2014 after Houthis overran much of the country, including the capital Sana'a. The UN-backed Government of National Accord says it has seized Khalifa Haftars Western military command in the Libyan Surman city. The military said troops advanced in a surprise attack on Haftar's forces after a night of intense airstrikes. The Libyan military said its forces took control of the Haftar forces investigations headquarters. It said troops will advance towards Sabratha after gaining the entire control of Surman. Government forces raids are part of the recently launched Operation Volcano Rage. Yesterday, the GNA accused the LNA of targeting civilian settlements and medical facilities in Tripoli. 2 people were killed in such strikes. North Korean leader Kim Jongun has replaced more than a third of the country's State Affairs Commission. State media said 5 out of 13 members of the country's highest decision-making body were changed in a major reshuffle. Former Defense Commander Ri Son-gwon, recently promoted to Foreign Affairs Minister, is one of the newly appointed members. 2 former foreign ministers were taken off the committee. The step was taken at the annual meeting of the country's Supreme People's Assembly. China says it is not eyeing political gains through its medical cooperation with other countries, rather a new global governance system. In an interview, Chinese envoy to the U.S., Wei Tiankai, said Beijing is not trying to become the leader of the world. He said Beijing and Washington should continue to improve bilateral ties. Wei said the outbreak slowed down in China, but the country is working hard to prevent a second wave of infections. He said China cannot succeed in this fight alone. The ambassador called for enhanced international cooperation as the pandemic is a global challenge. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has threatened Hungary with legal proceedings over new laws to slow the COVID-19 spread. Earlier this month, Hungary's parliament handed Prime Minister Viktor Orbán sweeping decree powers to deal with the crisis. Hungary's new law suspends parliament and introduces jail terms of up to 5 years for those spreading misinformation. Von der Leyen said imposing emergency measures to combat the virus was necessary, but they have to be proportionate and democratically controlled. While the EU's competition chief has warned of the bloc's businesses being vulnerable that can be subjected to a Chinese takeover. Margrethe Vestager said it's important to be aware of a real risk, and EU countries should buy stakes in companies to block the takeover threat. Meanwhile, police in Germany's financial capital Frankfurt were attacked by men with stones and iron bars while violating social distancing measures. Police said officers were attacked when they saw a large group of people on the streets who were blatantly ignoring lockdown rules. Germany has promised strong leadership to fight the COVID-19 pandemic when it takes up the presidency of the Council of the European Union on July 1st. The presidency is responsible for the functioning of the EU's legislative upper house. In an interview, the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said after assuming the presidency, the first tasks will be to lift restrictions on travel and the internal market. Maas said if the EU leaders learn from the current crisis, the bloc will come out stronger and more unified than ever before. The EU's presidency is currently held by Croatia and rotates among member states every 6 months. I'll be back after this break with plenty more news. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back. Italy has ordered migrants on board a rescue ship off its coast to be quarantined on another vessel to test them for COVID-19. German NGO Sea Eyes Alan Kurdi is sailing in international waters after rescuing 150 migrants off Libya's coast. Italy's transport ministry said disembarking the migrants without being screened will put pressure on Sicily's already stretched health services. Last week, Italy closed its ports to NGO vessels rescuing migrants in the Mediterranean for the entire duration of the national emergency. The UN Refugee Agency has raised the alarm about the fate of dozens of migrants whose dinghy is believed to have capsized. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said the migrants were going to Italy from Libya. Germany's Sea-Watch International group said it lost the boat which was carrying 85 people. 2 German monitors of dangerous migrant crossings first reported spotting 4 boats in distress off the southern coast of Malta over the weekend. The EU's Frontex Coast Guard agency later said one of the 4 boats had safely reached Italy and another 2 were still at sea. The 4th boat is still unaccounted for. Lockdowns being implemented across the world to contain the coronavirus have left countries' most economically vulnerable citizens without a source of income. This includes Brazil, where sanitation workers are struggling to make ends meet after the virus made its way to the country's shores. More on that now in this report.
Until recently, this plant has produced 8,000 tons of recyclable material, generating employment for some of Rio de Janeiro's poorest citizens. But the quarantine measures have forced the plant to shut down operations. The sudden change has left most employees unable to feed their families.
Our cooperative receives trash weekly. This week, the staff has nothing left, no money to buy their food and maintain their expenses. Have fun with the collection life today.
One sanitation worker says her fridge has been empty since Brazil started implementing quarantine measures.
It is very difficult right now. When I was working, at the end of the week, I was doing okay. My refrigerator was not full, but it was also not lacking. But now, it is like this.
Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has repeatedly called for the reopening of the country's economy, saying a recession would be more harmful than the coronavirus. But experts say lifting quarantine measures too early could create a need for an even stricter lockdown.
6 people have died after over a dozen tornadoes ripped through the U.S. states of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Officials said the tornadoes, with winds approaching 200 miles per hour, left behind a path of destruction. The Mississippi Emergency Management Agency confirmed the deaths across 3 counties. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves declared a state of emergency, saying several tornadoes had struck the state. The strong storms damaged up to 300 homes and other buildings in northern Louisiana. The Weather Service said a broader area from East Texas to the East Coast was under at least a marginal risk of storms. The National Weather Service warned that strong tornadoes and widespread damaging winds are possible for another day. The Pakistani Army says one of its training planes has crashed during a routine training mission near the city of Gujarat. The military's media wing said both pilots on board the aircraft were martyred in the incident. It said instructor Major Omar and student Lieutenant Faizan died on the spot. The Inter-Services Public Relations said Major Omar is survived by a wife. In the Central African Republic, 3 civil wars have left thousands of people handicapped or dealing with poor mental health. However, many physically disabled locals have found ways to stay fit and active. One of the most popular forms of exercise is wheelchair basketball. Details in this report.
Life with a disability is difficult anywhere, but it's particularly hard in one of the world's poorest countries. But in the Central African Republic, amputees have found solace in playing wheelchair basketball. Players swing into action using tricks to distract opponents, their wheelchair tires hissing across the court. Most dedicated basketball players have to travel several kilometers under the scorching sun every day.
When you are disabled, you tend to be unable to do anything. But through sport, we can get out of this handicap. We value ourselves like others. Why not go to the Olympic Games like others, like the able-bodied? Why not do great things in sport and even have a job through sport? So it gives us our dignity. It gives us hope.
Coping with prosthesis isn't easy either. Amputees have to go through hard training to learn how to walk, find a seat in the bus, or how to climb stairs.
I was amputated because of a bullet, and I was walking on crutches. Now with the prosthesis, I can work with my own hands, take care of my children, and be active in life.
But there are other injuries that aren't as visible as an amputation. The Central African Republic has been through 3 civil wars, which has left countless people suffering from mental health issues. Now, officials are working to build a new center to offer psychological help for people.
Of all the cases we get here, 50% are traumatic cases that are related to the conflict. They come here, we take care of them, then we make them custom prostheses, then we deliver them. Then we do the re-education, how to walk, how the person can use his device.
The World Health Organization estimates that there are 30,000 people dealing with amputation or high stress levels because of conflict in the Central African Republic. But the National Association of Rehabilitation believes the actual figure is likely 3 times higher than the WHO's estimate.
OPEC, Russia, and other oil-producing countries have agreed to cut output by 9.7 million barrels per day for the May to June period. The development was announced in a tweet by Kuwait's oil minister. The decision has been made to support prices amid the COVID-19 pandemic. This represents a record 10% reduction in the global oil supply. The group initially proposed cutting production by 10 million barrels a day, but Mexico opposed the amount it was being asked to cut. Under the new deal, Mexico will cut 100,000 barrels per day instead of 400,000. The agreement comes after 4 days of marathon talks and threats of tariffs against Saudi Arabia by U.S. President Donald Trump. The group of the world's 20 biggest economies' finance ministers and central bank governors will hold a meeting on Wednesday. Saudi Arabia state media said the meeting would discuss actions needed to address the global challenge presented by coronavirus. Now, traditionally, the April meeting of G20 finance ministers and central bank governors was to be held in Washington, but the forum's ministerial meetings are now being held via video link due to the global pandemic. In their last meeting held on March 31st, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors agreed on a roadmap to respond to coronavirus. Last week, the bloc's energy ministers held a virtual moot to discuss the oil crisis amid COVID-19. Asian stock markets have closed lower after sliding considerably as major indices lost steam over mounting recession fears due to COVID-19. However, oil stocks attracted a fresh rally as OPEC and allies reached that historic agreement to cut oil production. The Nikkei 225 closed over 2% lower as shares of Family Mart dropped over 7%. Seoul's Kospi lost nearly 2% as chipmaker SK Hynix stocks dropped over 3%. The Shanghai Composite traded nearly 0.5% lower. Markets in Hong Kong and Australia are closed for Easter Monday. Trading also remained suspended in European stock markets due to Easter holidays. Meanwhile, the international benchmark Brent crude oil price has dropped over 1%, pairing early gains. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. Well, for the latest updates on these and other stories, you can always follow us on our social media at Indus.News. Thanks for watching.